This video will be part 2 of my coverage of Karen Horney's Humanistic Psychoanalysis for PSY 230 Personality Theory. Now, the way Karen Horney described the structure of personality really will foreshadow what we will see in Carl Rogers' theory a bit further down the road during the semester. Horney felt that there was what she called a real self, but there was also an idealized self. And it was frequently the discrepancy between those two that was at the root of the experience of neurosis. She defined the real self as a set of potentials that the person has, which includes aspects like your baseline temperament of being, either energetic or irritable or whatever. Your basic temperament, capacities and talents that you may have, predispositions that you may have. She, like later Carl Rogers, would argue that this is a part of who you essentially are. So each person has a unique intrinsic set of potentialities that are predicted by their genetic makeup. If the person lands in a healthy, growth-promoting environment, that real self is allowed to develop and show itself. If, however, the person lands in an environment that is not conducive to that, then that real self can be suppressed. Defensive strategies arise when that environment is not healthy. So if you're in bad developmental circumstances, regardless of what type of those, so any situation where basic anxiety is magnified and it becomes more neurosis promoting in terms of its strength or its the timing of it, people can develop defensive strategies that allow them to feel emotions, but in this very truncated form. So what happens when people become motivated by defensive strategies is that they push the real self out of consciousness and instead try to construct a false image. Think this is Karen Horney's representation of how Jung would describe a persona. We erect a version of the self that we feel will get us will get our needs met. But it's a temporary fix. It's always going to leave us with a repository of unhealthy feelings. Defensive strategies, as described here, they're a replacement for genuine emotion. Genuine feelings arise out of the real self. Defensive strategies produce false emotions that eventually, they take the form of an idealized self. What that means is that from a functional standpoint, you are separating yourself from who you really are, you're pushing that aside, and you're living a false life. The requirements, so what does it take to allow the real self to express itself? She argued that it wasn't rocket science. What kids need, what children need, and what adults need is warmth. They need empathy. They need to have healthy challenges so that they can learn. And here she is echoing some of what Alfred Adler argued. People as children need to be challenged. They need to learn how to be resilient, and which is what she means by healthy friction with wishes and will. So kids need structure. They need expectations. They need challenge. But all of that has to take place within an atmosphere of warmth, where children are valued, they're allowed to express their own thoughts, and they're allowed to discover those intrinsic, natural talents and capacities. When that doesn't happen, what you see, according to Horney, is the development of what she called interpersonal strategies of defense. So interpersonal means relationships between people. People have to cope with basic anxiety that comes out of feeling weak in a world that feels threatening. So what we're talking about here is flawed developmental circumstances where basic anxiety has become a bit overpowering. So coping with that basic anxiety can be done in one of three basic ways. One solution, which she described as compliant or self-effacing, is to orient oneself almost exclusively toward other people, doing what they want, modifying yourself to be what they want, being dependent on them, and taking all of your sense of self-worth from the messages that they give you. If they reject you, you are horrible. If they accept you, you are loved. So essentially the compliant self-effacing solution is moving in the direction of others and only feeling valued if they take you in. The aggressive or expansive solution means conflict with others. You're moving against other people. So it's primarily a strategic defense of conflict and conquer. So you look at people as competition. You attempt to control them, and it's expansive because you're expanding yourself outside of yourself and saying, I have to control all these other people who are around me, whether it's controlling people at work or controlling people in your family, controlling the person you're in an intimate relationship with. It's solving this sense of your own weakness by controlling other people. And not really expressing any kind of meaningful sense of connection or empathy. So people they come into your atmosphere, but they're only allowed to be there to the extent that you can control them. So what you might see is an aggressive, expansive person who engages in a relationship with a compliant, self-effacing person. The third alternative is resigning, saying, nope, not going to have relationships with anybody. So one way of coping with basic anxiety is to say, relationships are too threatening, I'm not going to have any. So you become detached, you move away from people. Now that may not mean that you're not in contact with other people, but you don't have relationships with them. So you're aloof, you're detached, you're resigned. To not have close connections, because if you have close connections, that means people can hurt you. So for the compliant solution, you connect, but in an inauthentic and threatened way, constantly trying to be what other people want you to be, in an attempt to control the fear of being rejected. In the aggressive solution, you seek to conquer and control, because if you don't have control, it means you're weak. The detached solution is, people can hurt me, I'm not going to be hurt. I'm just not going to connect with them. That way, no one hurts me. Healthy people, in contrast to people who move extremely in any of these three strategies, healthy people move toward others, move against others, and move away from others in appropriate balance. So the healthy person is able to flexibly move in all three directions interpersonally. Neurotic people tend to use one solution disproportionately to the others, and in a way that becomes almost compulsive. So they're always driven, in Horney's description of it, by anxiety. They're always being driven by fear. The neurotic solution, this defensive solution, is inherently unbalanced. So in contrast to healthy people, neurotic people are, in a way, I use the word select, but I would prefer a different one. They're not mindfully choosing an approach. For instance, a girl with a negative childhood situation may be socialized in such a way that she sees the compliance solution as the normal. pattern of behavior for girls, whereas for a boy faced with overwhelming basic anxiety, they may be socialized in the direction of heavy competition and aggression and being dominant as the appropriate solution. So it can be pushed and shaped by cultural variables as well. She felt that gender socialization tended to push boys in the direction of aggression and or detachment, and it tended to push girls and women towards self-effacing compliant solutions. Not exclusively, but she felt that the gender socialization norms, certainly in Europe where she grew up, placed a great deal of pressure in that direction. Now I found this graphic, I've told you before, I'm a very visual person. She argued that you have basic anxiety is sort of the start point where you have parental behavior. You're a child. If there are parental threats, if there's hostility, if there are other kinds of negative pressures within the home situation, that anxiety can actually produce a basic sense of hostility as well. So, if you reflect on the idea that you can have kids who then turn into very angry adolescents, that basic hostility, she argued, was coming from a negative reaction to trying to find a solution for all of this anxiety. So she saw childhood feelings of rejection and neglect then become this hostility towards self that can also then be projected outward. If a child feels rejected or neglected by parents, they have to defend themselves against this basic anxiety, and it may turn into an inner directed sense of basic hostility, which reinforces basic anxiety, which reinforces the hostility. Now down here, eventually, as we age, as we move through childhood, we have to find some way to continue to survive. So we have to defend ourselves against anxiety. Now here she was in agreement with Freud. Freud believed that we develop defense mechanisms. And why do we develop defense mechanisms? To protect ourselves from what we fear. For Horney, it's the same, although the origin of the fear is different. She sees the origin of the fear coming in the context of culture and also within the family, not from the conflict between the id and the demands of living in a social environment. So you have defenses against anxiety. It can be normal. There are healthy defenses. So there are sometimes when you feel anxious because you might be lonely, you can make a normal movement toward other people where you get friendship, you get loving interactions with other people. There are situations where you are in actual competition with other people. You're competing for a job or a promotion. You're competing in sports that you enjoy. That pulls you into competition against other people. In some situations, it means you have to survive things that are hard, that are unfair, that are inappropriate. So you are drawn into competition, but you're doing it in a spontaneous and healthy way. Then there's also, appropriate times, healthy times when you need to be by yourself and where you can say, you know what, I need a me day. I need a day where I'm away from people, where I can think about myself, where I can be independent and be quiet. It's spontaneous and healthy in that you're moving kind of fluidly in and out of these zones of normal living. These defenses become neurotic when, as Horney puts it, they become compulsive, where you don't feel you can choose to move in one direction or the other. And they become compulsive to the degree that the person selects behaviors and feels more natural in one or the other or the other. And the other two become suppressed. So essentially, if you're seeing a person who's neurotic in the form of a compliant personality type, they will suppress their ability to be a survivor in a competitive society. They'll suppress their ability to be autonomous and to be okay with being alone, or even to value their time of quietude or solitude. The person who is the aggressive personality will suppress their need to have loving, friendly interactions with others and see those as weakness. They will also shy away from moments where they are alone, because who do they have to compete with and feel valuable? No one. So they feel when they're alone, they have to beat up on themselves, so they're not going to do that. If the person is a detached personality, they're going to suppress movement toward and movement against. What they're losing, friendly, loving interactions. They're losing their capacity to be a survivor, so they're not going to put themselves out there. They're not going to engage. They're going to live a very carefully, narrowly defined existence. Now let's explore each of these a little more completely. The compliance solution is essentially, in Horney's description of it, a solution of helplessness. So people are basically constructing their sense of self based on their need to be loved or to appear to be loved. Their solution to basic anxiety is by getting affection and approval. In a kind of twisted way, they're able to control other people by being dependent on them. There may be people in your life who you are already thinking in your head, oh, I know someone like that. This is a person who is desperate to be loved. They change who they are and how they look and how they behave to make other people like them. And they often appear to be needy and weak in such a way that other people need to do things for them. So in that way they can control others. Their sense of their own value may direct them to appear very, very good, very pure. They may show signs of outward sympathy and generosity and love and selfishness, but at the same time, underneath that is just this, it's just a veneer. It's just this cover. There's an outward expression that being egoistic, being ambitious, being unscrupulous are really bad things. So the person is going to reject these capacities that would be associated with the aggressive solution, while at the same time they're very seductive to the person. Their control of others is by being dependent on them, as opposed to being ambitious or egotistical or using overt forms of power. And in that way, they can be just as manipulative as an aggressive person, but they're doing it in a different way. She often talked about these neurotic solutions as a bargain. Basically, what you're doing inside your head, if you adopt the compliance solution, is saying, if I'm good, if I'm good enough, people will love me and they will take care of me, and I won't need to compete. I won't need to be alone. I won't need to be isolated. The downside, there are times in your life where you're not going to have someone to take care of you. You won't be able to stand. And there are times in your life where you'll need to survive a competitive environment. The compliance solution leaves the person very vulnerable as a result. The basic needs expressed by the compliance solution are the needs for affection, for approval, to have a dominant or expansive partner, someone who really will take charge, make decisions, and control what happens. Obviously, there are downsides to this. It means you're not really developing the capacity to make your own choices and decisions. You may, in fact, leave yourself open to abuse and the domination by another partner who doesn't relate to you as an equal. The expansive solution is a solution through mastery. And as she describes it, it's movement against others. It often takes the form of rebelliousness and resistance, but it can also be quite egomaniacal. If the world is seen as threatening, one solution to that is to dominate that world, to become all-powerful and all-controlling. So essentially, basic anxiety that was acquired in early childhood and then continues to persist, the messages that the child has gotten is you can overcome your fear by being tough, by being strong, by being powerful, by being dominant. These are people who learn to reject helplessness, who will tell others that helplessness is bad, that people are losers if they can't take control of themselves. If they are in pain, they feel ashamed, so they will cover their pain and their weakness by denying it. In order to be successful, they see themselves as really needing recognition for their success. As a result, they need a lot of recognition, they need a lot of stroking, they need a lot of prestige. So a lot of it is achieving mastery for the sake of appearing powerful while simultaneously not feeling powerful underneath it. So it requires constant demonstration of power. So the needs, the basic psychological needs here are needs for power, the need to exploit others, to use them, needs for prestige and recognition, needing other people to admire you, and so on. So as a result, they may seek out a partner, if they have partners, and they tend to be temporary. They will seek a partner that they can dominate, someone that they can control. She argues that there's three basic forms of the expansive solution. One that is purely narcissistic, where the person is very, very self-focused, and they're not particularly aggressive, but they're definitely focused on themselves and their own need to be seen as perfect, or their own need to be seen as valuable. The perfectionistic version of the expansive solution is attempting to master others, to compete with them by being the best of the best at everything, or at one specific sphere. And then finally, there's the most damaging to other people is an arrogant and vindictive expansive solution, where you have a person who is very egoistic, but they're simultaneously very angry. They tend to take offense, they tend to then get revenge and be very vindictive in their interactions with others. The detached solution tends to be individuals who make a lot of statements about independence and freedom and being able to feel at peace because they are self-sufficient, and not needing anyone. I know someone who should be the textbook picture of the detached solution. He's a man who he always struck me as, is erecting this sort of sense of addictive self-sufficiency. So he had this apartment. He rarely left the apartment. If he left the apartment, it was to do very, very specific things, like going to get food or to mail letters or whatever. And then otherwise, he was at home. And he did a very narrow bandwidth of activities. And if people asked him, why don't you do more things? Why don't you go do this? Why don't you go do that? And he would belittle those activities as taking away from his private pursuits. So moving away from others and detaching as a method of self-protection becomes very isolating. Basic anxiety is overcome by the sort of relentless pursuit of self-sufficiency, and then outward expressions of dismissal of others who pursue successes in the world of work, or who pursue family and intimate relationships as being somehow delusional. In some cases, she described these individuals as appearing to be lazy, but for the most part, the underlying emotion is a desperate fear of engaging in a world that could harm them. She argued that they have a strong need to appear superior to others by choosing this isolated path. They may look at other people with disdain by saying, look at you chasing the pursuit of happiness or chasing the pursuit of success. It's all a fraud. What you're doing is just, a waste of time and energy. See what I'm doing? I'm living this careful life of the mind. I'm separate. I'm free. No one tells me what to do. If I was in a relationship, I'd have to do what I was told. If I had children, I would have to put my needs behind theirs. All of these things. So the bargain that they're striking in order to control their basic anxiety is that, you know what, I'm not going to ask anything of other people, and other people can't ask anything of me, period. If they don't try to achieve anything, they won't fail. If they expect very little from their relationships, then they won't be disappointed in their relationships. So by detaching, they're never disappointed. Underneath it, though, you have basic human needs, and you're denying them. The needs become expressed in the form of restricting their lives within these very, very narrow ranges. So their lives become very, very restricted. They see themselves as self-sufficient and independent and living a life without control. But if you really just look under the surface, what they're really doing is engaging in neurotic self-restriction. So they aren't really free. They're living within this very narrow set of restrictions that they've set on themselves. And that concludes part 2.